This week's podcast features two showbiz greats, both of whom died in 2014. First, what made Mike Nichols such a genius? Ash, Carter, and Sam Kashner will be here to talk about their oral history, Life Isn't Everything. And how did Elaine Stritch's life capture the evolution of Broadway? Alexandra Jacobs will be here to talk about her biography, Still Here, the madcap, nervy, singular life of Elaine Stritch. Alexander also will give us an update from the publishing world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. Ash, Carter, and Sam Kashner join us now. They wrote together an oral history of Mike Nichols. It's called Life Isn't Everything, Mike Nichols as remembered by 150 of his closest friends. Sam, Ash, thanks for being here.
Yes, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
What was the genesis of this project?
Well, after Mike's death, I was at Vanity Fair and wanted to do an oral history as much as we can get away with in the magazine. And Ash had worked as a PA with Mike, and I knew him somewhat, and so I thought it best to join forces. And so we did this for the magazine originally, and it was so interesting, and there was so much material that it just kind of presented itself as a book kind of instantly as soon as we saw it together in the magazine.
It must have been painful to have to cut it down to magazine size.
Well, the piece was originally assigned at 6,000 words. It ran at 11,000, and still not a word practically about his theater career, about his time at the Compass Players as a founding member of improv. I mean, there was so much still on the table.
Ash, you are a very lucky person, having worked as a PA. What did you work on?
I worked on Charlie Wilson's War. That was my first job out of college. I was
Wow.
one of 5 PAs, so it was
that
a big
the
set.
Tom Hanks, Julia Roberts. What was that
Philip
like?
Seymour Hoffman.
Yes. Oh, right, of course.
It was a big movie, so very often you felt very distant from where the real action was taking place. But still, I really feel blessed to have been able to be as close as I was.
So you mentioned Charlie Wilson's War, and my immediate reaction is, oh my God, that's Mike Nichols also. The thing that I think people don't even fully appreciate now is just how incredibly accomplished he was, and for so long. So if we could just kind of begin with his, I think, first real fame was with Nichols in May. But before we go into each of those steps, just take us through, because I think people maybe associate him with The Graduate and a couple of other major projects, but let's just list some of them so people have a sense.
Well, there was the great success of the Nichols in May, Elaine May and Mike Nichols as a comedy team, which kind of transformed comedy, really. And Mike as a director, he and Neil Simon joined forces, and he really kind of, in a way, reinvented Simon for Neil Simon, with Barefoot in the Park and The Odd Couple. And as a film director, his first film was the Richard Burton, Elizabeth Taylor, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, which Frank Rich, other people believe to be maybe the best adaptation of a stage play for film ever. The Graduate, which was his second film.
It's just shocking.
And
Okay.
transformative, and Oscar-worthy. And then there's all the stage work. Tom Stoppard's The Real Thing.
David Rabe's Hurly Burly.
Even Streamers.
Yeah. Spam-A-Lot.
And Spam-A-Lot.
Yeah.
Eric Idle. I mean, it's a kind of protean, extraordinary range of gifts that he has.
Yeah, I mean, he directs Spam-A-Lot, I think, 2 years after doing Angels in America for HBO. I mean, that's range.
I don't want to go too much into his early life, but I think it's important to point out that this was a person who arrived here, didn't speak English, not his first language, goes to the University of Chicago, right? He meets Elaine May. Let's start there. What was it that made that pairing so extraordinary, and what did they do? You said that they revolutionized comedy.
Elaine May was the dangerous genius that entered Mike Nichols' life and changed him.
She was kind of the combustion engine, and he was the steering wheel a little bit.
Steve Martin told us it was the first time when he listened to those records, those bits or sketches, he said that I heard irony. They brought kind of a modernity to comic situations and things that comedians did not go near, such as the cost of funerals. It was the time of Jessica Mitford, the American Way of Death, and these were weighty subjects.
Adultery,
right?
The previous generation of comics from the 50s were people who came from vaudeville and the Borscht Belt. Nichols and May had a theater background and, both the classical repertory but also as improv actors. And by the way, they were also both in analysis and brought a level of psychological acuity to comedy that really hadn't been seen before.
Let's listen to just a clip of them from that period.
Someday, Arthur,
Mom.
You'll get married.
Mom.
And you'll have children of your own.
Mom.
And honey, when you do, I only pray that they make you suffer the way you're making me. That's all I pray, Arthur. That's a mother's prayer.
Okay, Mom, thanks for calling.
You're very sarcastic.
Mother, I'm doing my best now. You called me on the telephone. I tried to explain to you how...
Don't hit me. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I bothered you. And look, I hope I didn't make you feel bad.
Are you kidding? I feel awful.
Oh, honey, if I could believe that, I'd be the happiest mother in the world.
Oh, Mother, it's true. What do you think? I feel crummy.
Arthur, honey, why don't you call me sweetheart?
That's the one bit that's kind of, in a way, close to autobiography, at least for Mike. That was sort of his mother, in a way, and he had a very difficult relationship with her. After the death of his physician father, they were really plunged into serious poverty in New York.
You used to have to go in the olden days to the Museum of TV and Radio to watch these old clips, but now I'm imagining that you can see all of this on YouTube.
Yeah, there's a lot of great stuff on YouTube. I encourage people to also look up the award for total mediocrity that they did at the Emmys one year in the 1950s.
Well, that's just breathtaking because they're actually making fun of their own milieu, they're making fun of show business.
Were they successful right away?
They were both part of this very heady kind of avant-garde group called the Compass Theater in Chicago, and the two of them just clicked, as their manager Jack Rollins later said. They were like ham and eggs. They were a local hit first, then they came to New York. He signed them up as clients and started booking them at local nightclubs, and they were a hit right away. And then they started going on Jack Parr and Omnibus, and they were a hit nationally. So yeah, it was really just like that. It was that quick.
How does he get from that to Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf?
Well, they had a great success, Nichols and May, on Broadway at the Golden Theater. It was an evening with Nichols and May, ostensibly directed by Arthur Penn, but not really, And Elaine was just sort of tired of doing it. And in a way, it was like the comedic version of the Beatles breaking up. People were just chop-fallen,
I still think it's tragic.
Yes. Yeah, it was kind of a loss in a way. They would wind up working together eventually, as a screenwriter and director. But Mike, it kind of put him in the wilderness for a while. He was really at sea.
If we rewind a little bit to when he's got that evening on Broadway with Elaine, the theater they were in shared an alley with a theater where Camelot was on stage with Richard Burton, and they would kind of hang out after the show, and that's how he kind of got to know him. And it was essentially through that, meeting Richard in that alley, and through him, Liz, they were the ones who hired him for Virginia Woolf.
When you think about the collaborators he had, the people he got to work with, you mentioned Arthur Penn, although, lightly,
Right.
Richard Burton, Elizabeth Taylor, Dustin Hoffman, Jules Feiffer on Carnal Knowledge. It's just, on and on. Meryl Streep, the biggest names. And your subtitle is Mike Nichols as remembered by 150 of his closest friends. Did he frequently form friendships during these professional collaborations? Was he one of those people that everybody felt like they knew and were close to Mike?
Exactly. His actors and many of his writers really kind of fell in love with him. I mean, we could have called the book Seduced by Mike Nichols, you know. Natalie Portman really wept recalling her work with Mike to us, you know.
And that was much later, and the film Closer?
Yes. But also they did stage work together. So they were totally devoted to him. I mean, Tom Stoppard, for example, said, I think at Mike's memorial, you know, he thought to himself, who is there to write for? So he was kind of an avatar to all of these tremendously gifted, complicated people, and the friendships were very deep and very real.
Maureen Dowd, your colleague, said that he was a Noel Coward figure with a Jerzy Kaczynski past. And unlike a lot of other people who had really horrible childhoods, he did not kind of wear it on his sleeve, and he rarely talked about it and didn't particularly want to spend a lot of time thinking about it. And I mean, I think this is kind of the key to his career longevity, is that he was somebody who really always wanted to be living in the moment and kind of looking forward to the next project, even up until the end of his life, when he had several things that were in progress, including Masterclass, Terrence McNally's play that he was going to adapt for HBO with Meryl Streep.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, our title is taken from a motto of Mike's, life isn't everything, but it's kind of a misnomer because it was everything to him, you know, in a way.
He could be difficult too, right?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, and some of the people in the book are quite open about that.
Yeah.
Emma Thompson is one.
Right, exactly. Emma Thompson, who adored him, you know, said, we're not talking about some saint here, you know. And in fact, Mike, toward the end of his life, felt that he had been cruel to people and had betrayed others, you know. But he did develop, I mean, his book is also about someone who's sort of, as much of a genius as he was, you know, he was also a complicated, difficult cat and felt like there were people to apologize to.
Some people presumably wouldn't talk to you. Elaine May, of course, wouldn't. What about Diane Sawyer? And were there other people who you pursued and just said, you know what, no?
We did approach Diane. We wouldn't have done this actually without her benediction, you know. And she gave us the same response that initially Sam Beckett gave to Deidre Baer, you know, which is that I'm not going to stop you, but I'm also not going to help you all that much. But when push came to shove and we needed people such as Meryl Streep, she was helpful behind the scenes. And Elaine, you know, she did give us a blurb, although we didn't use it. And the blurb facetiously said, well, I would tell you all I know, but they're going to pay me millions of dollars to write my memoirs, something she'll never do. You know, she meant it as kind of a joke.
Before we go, one final question. What do you, each of you, think was Nichols's greatest work? And then also perhaps a personal favorite, maybe less known, or just something you especially loved, and why? Let's start with you, Ash.
I would say probably The Graduate. It's not the most original choice, but I just have seen the movie so many times, and I think that it just has held up so much better than a lot of other youth movies at the time, that it was sort of lumped in with. That plus the comedy albums is sort of where my original enthusiasm for him started. But, you know, I think Catch-22, for example, is a movie that has not really gotten its due. I think it's actually kind of a brilliant movie that was overshadowed by MASH at the time, though I see no reason why the existence of MASH should prevent people from enjoying it today.
Not an easy novel to adapt to film.
No, but I think him and Buck Henry did an incredible job adapting it.
Sam?
Well, I mean, it's so hard to choose. I mean, my mother would choose Working Girl or Silkwood, you know, but...
Are you saying your mother would be wrong?
No, well, my mother's never wrong, I guess. But for me, it's, you know, the stage work is kind of extraordinary. I mean, the Philip Seymour Hoffman Death of a Salesman at the end of Mike's life.
That was amazing.
That was really just was an extraordinary accomplishment, really. It brought him full circle because that and Streetcar were the two original productions that changed his life, really.
All right. I'm hoping that this interview, if nothing else, forces everyone to go to YouTube, everyone to go and stream every single thing that Mike Nichols did that was available. He was such an incredible talent. Ash Carter, Sam Kashner, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Their new book is called Life Isn't Everything, Mike Nichols as Remembered by 150 of His Closest Friends. So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Elizabeth Flock joins us from Washington. She is a producer at the PBS NewsHour and our partner in the Now Read This book club. And we are ready to announce our next month read. Liz, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So we have a novel coming up for the month of December. Tell us about this month's Now Read This pick.
Our December pick is Circe by Madeline Miller. It's a novel that reimagines the story of a minor but rather notorious character from the Odyssey. Circe is a sorceress who you may remember from the epic poem of having turned men into pigs. And what Madeline Miller, who's a classic teacher, is doing here is really keeping some of the characters and settings the same from the Odyssey, but telling a story from a entirely different perspective, which is Circe's. It's a sort of feminist perspective. She's a goddess with the heart of a mortal. She's finding herself. It's a really delightful book with a lot to discuss, so I'm excited we're doing it for the book club.
Now, does she change the setting for the story? Is it modern times?
No, it's set then, but there's definitely certain changes she's made. A lot of the book follows Circe when she's banished to a deserted island where actually quite a lot happens, including entangling with Odysseus and meeting the Minotaur. It's a book that's both epic in scope, but also quite intimate. You know, you see the Greek gods as kind of quite petty characters in certain ways. So yeah, it's a really interesting take. She kind of shifts the perspective of examining it from sex and love and gender in a different way. So it's a really interesting book.
Tell us a little bit about Miller and her first novel.
Her first novel was The Song of Achilles, and it was a huge bestseller. Circe has become one as well.
All right. So the book is now available in paperback. If people are eager to join Now Read This and are not yet members, what do they do?
Well, if you're on Facebook, you can join us there. We have a Facebook group, Now Read This, with 75,000 members now reading the books together and discussing it there. Or you can join our newsletter. If you're not on Facebook, it's bit.ly/Now Read This newsletter, and all of our content, discussion questions, annotated pages from the authors, interviews with the authors, they're all on the PBS NewsHour and the New York Times website as well.
All right. And so Madeline Miller will be on at the end of the month. She'll be on PBS NewsHour answering questions. If you have a question for Madeline Miller after you read the book or while you're reading it, you can post it on Facebook. We do look at those questions and consider them for that broadcast interview.
Absolutely. So we hope you join us and read along.
Liz, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Elizabeth Flock is a producer at the PBS NewsHour. They are our partner on the Now Read This book club, which you can join anytime by going online to Facebook or signing up for our newsletter.
And here's to the girls on the go. Everybody tries. Look into their eyes and you'll see what they know. Everybody dies. A toast to that invincible bunch. The dinosaurs surviving the crunch. Let's hear it for the ladies who lunch. Everybody rise. 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 Rise.
And that was, of course, Elaine Stritch, who died in 2014 and is the subject of a new biography by Alexandra Jacobs. The book is called Still Here, The Madcap, Nervy, Singular Life of Elaine Stritch. Alexandra, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Alexandra is my colleague here at the Times, where she is the deputy editor of This Styles Desk, which makes this somewhat of a departure. How did you get involved in writing a biography of Elaine Stritch?
Well, at the time, I was a fashion critic for the Styles desk, which was not a very good fit for me. And I had just come home from a very glamorous tour of duty in Europe. And I was on a plane and saw the documentary Six by Sondheim. And there's a clip of the D.A. Pennebaker documentary of the making of the cast album of Company. And Elaine Stritch was singing a song about marriage, not The Ladies Who Lunch. And she was just so compelling. And I thought, wow, that's the same woman who was in that show At Liberty. How did that happen? How did she get from there to there? First of all, I obsessively started listening to and watching Sondheim material. The book really sort of grew out of thinking about their professional relationship. And when I learned she was having a memorial service in November, I wangled my way into it, even though I wasn't covering theater. Her lawyer got up at the memorial and said, if anyone's interested, her papers are being held at New York Public Library. And I thought, her papers?
What were her papers?
Well, it was wonderful. I mean, this was a biographer's dream or journalist's dream, anyone's dream who's interested in this kind of work. They had not been filed yet. No one public had seen them. I mean, I think actually various people in her life had seen them, but I don't believe any journalist had seen them before. And it was everything from newspaper clips, gossip items from the very beginning of her career and even before that when she was growing up in Detroit. There were telegrams from Noel Coward. There were letters from young men that she dated in high school who had been drafted for World War II. There was everything from that to contracts from 30 Rock. It was just this incredible goldmine motherlode of material that was unfiled, and they very kindly let me in. And I just felt at that point I had no choice but to draft a proposal.
For those who don't know who Elaine Stritch is, just tell us a little bit about her. What made her different from other grand dames of Broadway?
I think it was her sheer persistence more than anything else, and probably also her sheer stockings on her long legs. I mean, Elaine started her career in high school. She came to New York very young.
What year was that?
That was 1943. So, it was an incredibly lucky year to come to New York if you were pursuing a life in show business, because Leonard Bernstein was taking over at the Philharmonic, and Oklahoma, it was the big hit musical. It was like the Hamilton of the day, and it had revolutionized musicals. And there's just all this stuff going on. And, of course, the war was still going on, so there was this carpe diem feeling, and it was very exciting time to be in New York. She had a lot of struggles and failures, and she just did not give up. I think it was John Lahr who said something to me in an interview. It was like, for people like her and his father, Burt Lahr, who was the Cowardly Lion in The Wizard of Oz, it was like there was no other option for them. She had no plan B, is what he said. That it was
Broadway or bust.
Exactly.
And she came from Detroit, but from a family of privilege. This was not a kind of scrappy, down on her heels girl coming to New York to become a star out of nowhere, right?
Yeah. I mean, on the other hand, her mother certainly came from privilege. Her father had really worked his way up. His family was from very humble circumstances. And, it was sort of the American dream. He'd worked in a seed factory and really clerk and all these things. And then he got a job at one of the leading tire companies. It was the rubber capital of the world, that area. And he kept getting promoted. It was like really that old-fashioned thing of staying at one company for a very long time, being rewarded for your loyalty, being rewarded for your service, and getting promoted. And so he had established himself, but he certainly instilled in his daughters, there were 3 girls, Elaine was the youngest, the importance of work. And also, remember, she was born in 1925, so she was sort of coming into consciousness in the thick of the Depression, and they didn't lose all their money, but there were certainly people around them who struggled. And so I just think if you grow up in the 30s in America, no matter where you are, you're conscious that you could lose it all at any minute.
Did Elaine have that feeling of she could any minute fail? Because she certainly did endure failures, significant ones, later on in her career.
I almost titled the book, Why Not?, which is another expression of hers. And I just felt like that was such a good mantra or just thing to think about. Why not? It's like a version of feel the fear and do it anyway. And Elaine was an early adopter of that, as she was of so many other things. I mean, she really was ahead of her time or out of time, as I say in the book.
People who encountered her late in her career, you mentioned At Liberty, her one-woman show on Broadway. I mean, her voice was very distinctive. It was not what one would call a beautiful voice. It wasn't a voice like a bell. It was very distinctive and raspy. And was it always that way? And was that part of the draw, that her voice was just different from what else was out there?
She just was not a conventional woman. You know, her voice is very low, and she could even pass for a boy or a man. I mean, she was cast as a boy in one of her high school plays, and she almost always had short hair, and she would often wear ties or men's shirts.
She was gender fluid before its time.
Exactly. And so, yeah, I mean, Stephen Sondheim does a wonderful analysis of her voice in the book. He said, it's not really a singer's voice. It's like a nightclub voice. I think her musicality, her rhythm, her sense of timing were incredible. And she also just had a way of working with whatever audience she had to communicate with them whenever she was singing.
You mentioned Sondheim. What was her association with him, and how did it begin?
As he told it, they first met at a party, I think, sometime in the late 50s, maybe early 60s, but at someone's house. I mean, at that time, they had a lot of friends in common. He talked a lot about them playing together at the piano late at night at 3 a.m, and that they were, just sort of together at the piano, which I think is the most wonderful image to have. The interesting thing is that when Elaine Stritch met Stephen Sondheim, he was not a known quantity as a composer. She was more successful and famous than he was. She'd been several Broadway shows, and in 1961, I think it was, she was the lead in Sail Away, the Noel Coward production. He went and saw her in Goldilocks. I think he said he saw it in Philadelphia. He was younger than her, and he took a little longer to establish himself as the full-fledged genius composer that we all know him to be now. He started out as a lyricist and was the lyricist at West Side Story, and then he did Funny Thing Happened on the Way, the Forum, which was so wonderful. That was music and lyrics. So meanwhile, Elaine is, in Bus Stop, and she's getting all these... I had several moments when I was researching this book when I sort of screamed, feeling like I'd seen stuff that people hadn't really thought about before or seen before, written about before. And one of them was learning that she'd been offered, or at least thought she'd been offered, the role that Angela Lansbury was given in Anyone Can Whistle, which is one of Sondheim's flops. But, it's just moments like that in history when you see a letter that Elaine Stritch has written to Noel Coward. I don't like that part that Stevie Sondheim and Arthur Lawrence want to give me,
When did they ultimately first collaborate?
I mean, their first real collaboration was for the incredible musical Company, which is coming back to Broadway this spring with a female in the lead, which is traditionally a male, and now it's a woman in this production. And this is the musical that put Sondheim on the map as a composer. Mm-hmm. I mean, even though, again, Funny Thing Happened on the Way, the Forum had been a hit, he hadn't gotten the credit he really deserved. So this is a landmark collaboration with Hal Prince, and the role of Joanne, which is being played and will be played on Broadway by Patti LuPone, was written for Elaine Stritch. And that was another screaming moment in the research for this book, because I went back into the archives of George Firth, who wrote the book for Company and was a great friend of both Sondheim and Stritch's. And Company is based on some one-act plays that he wrote. And the story of that has been told quite a bit. But when you go back and look at Firth's notes and his scripts and all that, which are deep in the bowels of the New York Public Library, and one of the one-act plays he wrote is about an actress in her dressing room drinking, and her name is Lorraine Birch. And I was like, when I saw that, I was like, oh my God. He had clearly sat in a room with her and taken notes while she expounded and, did what she did, which was storytell and
drink.
And drink, exactly.
Let's talk a little bit about that, because a big feature of her story, and certainly a large part of the way that she told her own story in At Liberty, was her alcoholism.
That was a very tricky part of the book for me, because I wasn't familiar with addiction and addiction culture. And Elaine acknowledged herself as an alcoholic. She went to Alcoholics Anonymous. She had a sponsor. She sponsored, all those things. her relationship with alcohol kind of mirrored America's relationship with alcohol. You know, she was born during Prohibition, and then Prohibition is rolled back during the 30s. And after the war, you know, it's 50s and everyone's drinking. And she's in New York when cocktail culture and drinking culture is really ascendant. And then, you know, then comes the rise of the recovery movement and self-help. And Elaine pretty much paralleled all that. Mm-hmm. I believe that Elaine was sober for long stretches, mm-hmm. But I think that she was not as sober as she portrayed in
At Liberty?
At Liberty, correct. However, I'm not really sure that it matters.
Even without the alcoholism, Elaine Stritch was not known to be an easy person. What made her so difficult to work with?
I believe that Elaine had incredibly high standards, not just for herself, but for everybody, for a whole production. I mean,
That's fun for your colleagues.
Well, she didn't have like the kind of higher education that, you know, Stephen Sondheim has, for example, but an incredibly intelligent woman and knew quality. She would do bad production. She'd pick up TV shows or do roles for money. But, you know, she really wanted the work to be good. I mean, you see that in the D.A. Pennebaker documentary of Company. There's this famous scene of her trying to get Ladies Who Lunch right. And she'd been tippling at the champagne or the white wine they had around. She just, you know, it was late at night. She just couldn't get it. And you just see how furious she is at herself.
Going back to the earlier question of what attracted you to Elaine Stritch for the subject and then working on this book, clearly you admire her. What is it that you most wanted to convey that made Elaine Stritch so distinctive and special and someone who deserves to be remembered in a biography and deserves to have her work continue to be acknowledged?
I think she was a pioneer. I mean, this is someone whose career went all the way from telegrams to Twitter. And by the way, the kind of one-liners she was putting in telegrams, those translate into social media. She defied expectations for what a woman was supposed to do at that time, especially a woman from her background, which was get married and, you know, have children. And she was alone. She did it alone. She came to New York and she just wouldn't stop.
We began with a clip of Elaine Stritch from Ladies Who Lunch. Let's end with one of your personal favorites.
It's Everybody Says Don't from Anyone Can Whistle.
Don't, it isn't nice. Everybody says no.
Alexandra Jacobs is the author of Still Here, The Madcap Nervy Singular Life of Elaine Stritch. Alexandra, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I say do. I say walk on the grass it was meant to feel. I say sail. Tilt at the windmill, and if you fail, you fail. Everybody says don't, everybody says don't, everybody says don't. Get out of line. When they say that, then, lady, that's a sign. 9 times out of 10, lady, you are doing just fine. Make just a ripple. Come on, be brave.
Alexandra Alter is here now with some news in the publishing world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
So some political news.
Yes, once again, the political news has seeped into publishing, and I keep waiting to see if there's going to be reader fatigue when it comes to books about Trump or by a Trump, and there seems to be no stopping publishers or readers from devouring these books. But another title caught my attention this week. I was waiting to see which publishers would jump on the House Intelligence Committee's report on impeachment. Since the Mueller report, as you remember, was such a huge hit earlier this year, there were several publishers who released it, and it was a bestseller for them. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies. And similarly, publishers, I think, are looking to package the impeachment report, which is a public document, so they don't have to pay for it. And the first one that I noticed was Random House. They're going to publish the impeachment report with an introduction by John Meacham, and it's coming out soon. It's coming out December 17th from Broadway Books. So I'm sure we'll see more of these coming, and I'll be curious to see if it does as well as the Mueller report. I think there's a good chance it might, because I think, like the Mueller report, this is a really complex issue that's been in the media a lot, but I think people want to evaluate the facts for themselves and look at all the testimony and look at the phone records. All of that is in there. But, you know, with an introduction from a very well-regarded biographer and scholar. I'll be curious to see how that does. And then in terms of other political books, if you look at our bestseller list, it's astonishing to see just in the top 10 for nonfiction, 4 of the titles are political books. You have Michelle Obama's Becoming still hanging in there. You have Donald Trump Jr.'s Triggered. You have A Warning by Anonymous. That's the unnamed senior Trump administration official. And new this week at number 3, you have Crime in Progress, which is by Glenn Simpson and Peter Frisch, the founders of Fusion GPS, and that looks at their investigation into Donald Trump and his ties to Russia. So all 4 of these are in the top 10, and I think that group of titles is really interesting because it also illustrates how publishers are trying to cover their bases politically. You have, on the one hand, Anonymous, who is extremely critical of President Trump and argues that he's unfit for office and a threat to the country. And then you have Donald Trump Jr. Last week, those 2 were at, the very top of the list. Both, interestingly, are published by Hachette. I think that's the perfect illustration of how publishers are not really picking sides. I mean, they want to appeal to all these audiences, and all the major publishing companies have dedicated conservative imprints.
We obviously know our politics are polarized. These books reflect that. But even the publishing process around these books has been pretty fraught and politicized itself.
Absolutely.
Where people are asking questions about the bestseller status of Donald Trump Jr.'s book. And people are asking about whether and how might Anonymous benefit or not from the proceeds of this book. And does this person deserve this platform? So it's really, the controversy does not seem to stop.
No, and even the sales and marketing channels are polarized. With Donald Trump Jr.'s book, there were questions about his bestseller status, or his ranking rather, because it had the little dagger symbol next to it, which indicates bulk sales. And as I learned through some reporting I did with our colleague Nicholas Compassori, Republican groups really did bolster his sales. They made a lot of bulk purchases. The Republican National Committee spent almost $100,000 on those books at Books A Million, and there were other groups that bought a significant amount. That's not uncommon for political titles, but it does, raise questions when you have the little dagger symbol. So
I want to add one thing here for our listeners. It's a little bit of inside baseball, but it might help explain why Alexandra and I don't just have the answer about what happens with the bestseller list, given that it is the New York Times bestseller list. And the answer is, just so you know, the New York Times bestseller list team operates total independence from the book review editorially and from our newsroom. And that is why we can't just go over and say, show us those sales,
Believe
guys.
me, I tried. They will not divulge their secret sauce to me because it's each bestseller list accounts for things differently, and they take into account sales at a number of retailers across the country. And so, I'd love to know what retailers are reporting to them, but that's not something they share with me.
Yeah, the bestseller team is a vault that not even the toughest, hard-nosed New York Times publishing reporter Alexander Alter can penetrate. But nonetheless, very interesting insight on what's going on with these political books. Alexandra, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Greg Coles, Emily Aiken, and John Williams. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
John, let's start with you because you've got 2 books in front of you.
Yeah, I've got 2 books I'm going to talk about even more because I'm down a rabbit hole of the author Jean Stafford. Parl Sagal reviewed last week The Library of America just reissued Stafford's 3 novels. She was a mid-century American writer who was married to the poet Robert Lowell, really, really catastrophic, horrible marriage. And she herself won the Pulitzer Prize for her collected short stories, and she wrote these 3 novels. And so the Library of America reissued them, and Parl used the occasion to write the way she does so beautifully about the larger context of a writer's life and career. And so I finally read, which I've been meaning to for a long time, The Mountain Lion, which is a novel of hers from the late 1940s, issued by the New York Review of Books Classics line. It's a great book. It's about 2 siblings who are in California, and they go for the summers to their uncle's ranch and get more of a life in the wild. And they like the uncle. They want to find this mountain lion that they don't know if it's mythical or if it's really in the area. But what it's really about is it's about the siblings' relationship to each other. Michiko Kakutani, writing about Stafford more generally, called it a densely symbolic novel about the coming of age of 2 strange young children in the American West. The girl, Molly, who's 8 when the book starts, is the most indelible character in it. She's this incredibly misanthropic, just always itemizing the ways in which she hates different people, different relatives and friends. And she loves, she's very close to her brother Ralph, who's 10 when the book starts. They eventually grow apart throughout the course of the book, and she ends up also hating him for a very kind of eerie psychological reason that isn't fully ever explained. This isn't a crossover book. It's very much about young children, but it's very dark. It's very psychological, and it's really about the way that life changes when you start becoming more aware of things like death and betrayal and the way that people are different from you when you thought that they were the same. I'm about to read Anne Hulbert's 1992 biography of Stafford, which is supposed to be really great. And it turns out that there was one just 4 years before that in 1988 by a writer named David Roberts. And Joyce Carol Oates wrote this incredibly negative but really smart review of the Roberts biography, talking about how it was, she calls it a pathography, not a biography, and how it just focuses so much on Stafford's incredibly hard medical problems and, the difficulties in her life, that it's just very claustrophobic and kind of sick feeling instead of getting into really the brilliance of the work and some of the other things. And I'm just going to finish. I know I'm going on, but what it really sent me back to, which is one of my favorite things of all time, which I had read way before I read Stafford, it's a short reminiscence by her good friend Wilfred Sheed, who's one of my favorite writers. He was a book critic and essayist, and he wrote this 7-8 page essay called Miss Jean Stafford, which was a remembrance of their friendship and about her very difficult life, but how she kind of kept this dark humor throughout it and was great company to her friends. And there's this one paragraph toward the beginning where he's at her funeral, at Stafford's funeral, and she had been taken care of by a lot of different friends in the Hamptons as she got older and declined in health. And he says there's this incredible fact about how she left her inheritance to someone who was not close to her. And it says, for several years, Jean had practiced a willful cantankerousness, part funny and part not, part high style and part bitterness, which was calculated to leave everyone in two minds about her. As if to symbolize this, her cleaning woman and sole heir stood slightly apart from the other mourners, looking a mite embattled in her smart tattersall pants. The legacy was like a short story ending. Jean had bypassed a lot of old friends to make some mysterious private point. On a last whim of flippancy or resentment, Jean had even appointed this good woman her literary executor, creating a last dollop of chaos to remember her by.
That appears in a collection, right?
That appears in a collection called Essays in Disguise, which I think has long been out of print, but that I buy copies of at used bookstores to kind of hand out like candy to friends. It's a terrific...
Have you gotten yours?
I have not.
I don't think any of you have gotten one.
either.
I'm sorry. Yeah, it's a book that I highly, highly recommend to people, and it's available very cheap on the internet. Emily, what are you reading this week?
Well, I happen to be reading a book that also features a slightly misanthropic young girl. I'm reading How to Be a Family, the Year I Dragged My Kids Around the World to Find a New Way to Be Together by Dan Coyce. And I have to begin with a rather shameful confession, which is I harbor a reflexive aversion to books about motherhood and parenting. And this aversion stems from an impression that no matter how sophisticated or perceptive the writer, there's always a sense they convey that they're bringing novel tidings from this world of experience that no one has ever been through before. And so here's Dan Coyce, a magazine writer and editor at Slate who hosts a parenting podcast and has written this book. And he's completely won me over. This book is about a fantasy that I think I speak for all parents when I say it's a fantasy that hits about middle of the elementary school, middle school years. And that fantasy is there's got to be a better way to do this, to be a better way to parent. And for Dan, that fantasy hit during a trip on assignment in Iceland, where he encounters at a thermal bath, of course, a perfect Icelandic family, a movie star handsome father and mother, and their 3 articulate, poised, charming children. Cut to his life back in suburban Alexandria, Virginia, where
there are no thermal baths.
There are no thermal baths, but there's a lot of Diet Coke and insomnia and emailing work emails from bed, while his wife, a First Amendment lawyer, is toiling on briefs in the basement, and his kids are stressed out, addicted to screens, and not sleeping either. So Dan does that unthinkable thing. He enacts that fantasy we all have, and he packs up his family, rents his house, and goes abroad. He goes to 4 places. He does a lot of research before he takes off, and the 4 stops on their world tour are New Zealand, the Netherlands, Costa Rica, and rural Hays, Kansas. Yes, that last one always elicits a kind of puzzled.
Yeah, I mean, I've read about this book, but I didn't realize that it went to Kansas.
Yeah. That baffling last stop. I won't spoil it for you all, but I'll say that New Zealand, despite its recent, very disturbing resurgence of white nationalism, does sound like the parenting paradise we've all suspected it is. There are a lot of free-range kids there. The parents practice what one father described as benign neglect as a kind of parenting ideology, and it's working really well. New Zealand was lush, beautiful, interesting, but I want to talk a little bit about the section on the Netherlands, because even the Icelandic father, that perfect man, said to Dan, if I could go anywhere, I would go to Holland. It's the most advanced country. And Dan picks up this book called The Happiest Children in the World. And of course, it's about Dutch children. And he can't wait. And he gets there. He moves to Delft, where he enrolls his kids in a local school, a Dutch public school. And it doesn't go well at all.
Oh, that's so interesting. I was going to say, my best friend actually just from childhood just enacted this fantasy and moved in August with her 2 kids and husband to Amsterdam because they just think...
because, the happiest kids are there.
That's right.
Well, it turns out his daughter, Lyra, 11, who is so bright and original, independent-minded, skeptical of authority, her mother, the lawyer's daughter in some ways, gets into an argument, I think practically on the first day, about using a certain color pen for an assignment. And it goes downhill from there. Soon there's a meeting with the teachers in which the Dutch teachers sort of painstakingly articulate the problems they're having. This is a child who's just not cooperating. And it turns out, of course, Dan researches this and discovers that in Holland, the values of child education have to do with cooperating with others, consensus building. There's something called the polder model, in which corporations spend endless time in meeting, kind of building ideas that everyone can get on board with, whether they're the best idea or the worst. The point is to get everyone to participate, and families use this model in their own interactions. There's a lot of negotiating and making sure that everyone is working together harmoniously. All of these traits
are un-American
and very un-Lyra. She as the Dutch teacher unwittingly, in a kind of mistranslation, puts it so perfectly, she is a, quote, revolting child. A child in full revolt. And those of you who know the lyrics to the Matilda song, which
I was
Dan
just
invokes,
thinking it.
will get this. So
I would pair this book with The Mountain Lion for people. The girl in the mountain lion is definitely in full revolt.
So happiness in the Netherlands turns out to be a very Dutch form of happiness built on conformism and consensus building. So I don't want to spoil the book for the rest of you. I will say that, it's very interesting what the family takes away from their year abroad. I think they're very happy to come home. I will say that their stop in Kansas leads them, to their own surprise, to become churchgoers. And they do end up returning to Virginia enlightened and sobered by their journey.
Greg, speaking of people who have written about parenting and in a revolt mode.
Yeah, Rachel Cusk would definitely not like the Polner method. I have enthused on this show before about the first 2 books in Rachel Cusk's Outline trilogy, Outline and Transit, and I have intended for a year, or even before it was officially published, to get to the 3rd book, Kudos. And I've brought it with me on vacation. I've kind of always had it as the next book in the pile, and then something moved ahead of it. I'm finally reading Kudos, the 3rd book in the trilogy, and kicking myself a little that it took me so long, although you fall right back into the voice and the sensibility. These books, it's a first-person narrator, and they have that auto-fiction feel where they just kind of hurtle through everything that she's going through. But then she very carefully extracts herself. So they become a series of kind of one-sided conversations where Faye, the narrator, is the foil in the conversation and kind of the goad or the interlocutor, but you don't get her side of the conversations except every now and then. You get more her drawing other people out and their stories. And she's very good at, the people who are talking to her talk like nobody talks to me. And I presume
she gets good stories from people.
That's the big mystery of these books. Is she's sort of an empty vessel for everyone else's story.
But she's not an empty vessel is the thing. She's got such an amused sensibility. There's a scene early in here where she's talking to her publisher, her German publisher. The book is set in an unnamed European city, but you can Google around and figure out that it's Cologne, Germany. And she's talking to her publisher there. And she describes him as telling a story with a slight smile on his face. And that's the tone of this book. Faye always has a slight smile on her face as she's telling you these things.
You know, I feel like this book it's about storytelling, right?
Oh,
it's about the
absolutely.
effect of people's stories on you, whether or not you've directly experienced them, but just in hearing the story or having it told to you, it sort of infiltrates your consciousness in a way that reminds me, folks, of Emmanuel Carrère's Lives Other Than My Own. And there was a scene in the first book, Outline, where she's telling the story, or someone is telling a story to her of a dinner party that they were at. Do you remember this? Where the ceiling was glass above the dinner table. And at that dinner party, someone was recounting the story of how at another dinner party there was a glass roof over the dining table and that the weight of the snow or the rain on the glass caused it to shatter all over the table. And that story then affected the people at the current dinner party, which then affected the telling of the story to Faye, which then, of course, affects you, the reader, thinking, wow, that would be really terrible.
Those nesting stories are such a characteristic effect of these books, where somebody starts telling a story and either interrupts himself to say, which reminds me of another story, or is interrupted by, well, that reminds me of this story. And so you get these kind of, you almost have to chart it with Post-its on the wall to figure out what's going on. I'm glad that you mentioned Outline. This book, like Outline, opens with Faye on an airplane, where Outline opens very memorably. She's flying to a writers' conference in Greece and sitting next to kind of a squalid, short, ugly guy who's got this real sexual charisma.
I'm trying to think of a real person that fits that description.
This book also opens with Faye on a plane flying. I don't think now it's a writers' conference. It's more like a book festival. Talking to she has become famous over the course of this trilogy. Hence, kudos. She's now accepting her well-deserved place in the literary sphere, and gets into a conversation with the guy next to her who, unlike the first book, he's very tall and gangly and he can't quite fit into his seat, and there's a lot of physical comedy going on. I think the comedy in these books is not remarked on enough. She writes with a real clinical precision that can come across as cool, but there is such an arch amusement throughout that, and there are little things as the stories repeat that reverberate off each other so that you can see that she's toying with themes. And one of them is this question of tone and of emotional distance as an intellectual self-defense. She talks about it in history, that history is memory without the pain. And she talks about it in literature, and she talks about it in storytelling, that you need to give yourself a certain distance from events to be able to tell them with that kind of ironic detachment that then gives you the voice of the writer.
Yeah, because I was going to say that I sort of strenuously disagree with a lot of the talk around those books about her being, it's like, it's a trilogy about people mansplaining to her or something.
No,
I mean,
who says that?
Well, it's out there. But
half of the anecdotes are from women.
Well, and they're also, but you get her psychological experience of the conversations. You don't hear her talking, but you get her sort of picking these people apart.
Yeah, again, you think that these conversations wouldn't happen except for her. I mean, she's the one.
Well, that's what I mean
feel
by
like
the
she's
mystery.
in control.
Yeah.
Why does she elicit this compulsion to confess to her? She's such a remorseless observer of her interlocutors, and even to call them interlocutors is to sort of exaggerate her part.
I sort of picture her as this. You don't see it because you're inside her head, but she's like outwardly she must seem like an empath, but inwardly she is like dissecting people. So there's this sense of like people feel safe to talk to her for some reason, but inside the writer in her is going no. Pamela, what are you're still in the middle of a big one.
Yeah, well, there's nothing funny about Richard Nixon.
He's a little bit funny.
He was on Laugh-In.
I'm still reading the one-volume biography of Richard Nixon by John Farrell. which I talked about briefly, I realized that I have this tendency to read memoirs by people who might be considered unreliable narrators, and then later to read a biography of them and sort of get the real story. So this was with Claire Booth Luce. I read a memoir by her, and then later read the Sylvia Jukes Morris biography. I went through a phase in college where I read a lot of books by Richard Nixon when he was kind of, reframing himself as a kind of elder statesman, books like In the Arena. And I recently learned that John Farrell is writing a biography next of Ted Kennedy, and I read True Compass. And so, and all three of these people, probably pretty obviously might not be the most reliable narrators of their own stories. This Richard Nixon biography I'm enjoying immensely. It's really quite a feat when you think about it to get this in one volume. He makes the point that Stephen Ambrose, with his, major Nixon biography, took 3 volumes, and that was before the release of all the tapes. Wow. And you think about the amount of material that Farrell has, every sentence really could be a full chapter. At this point, I am during his vice presidency, and even up until that point, there's so much. There's the Alder Hiss Whittaker Chambers episode. There's McCarthyism. There's, of course, his childhood, which I talked about a couple of weeks ago on the podcast. And I'm always kind of interested in the biography of people that many readers might think of as, not a hero, and sort of how did they get there? How did they become this person? And there is a lot to say about Richard Nixon's early life. And so I'm going to, again, offer a little bit of a sort of sympathetic, interesting glimpse. I'm going to talk about a period during Eisenhower's first term. Eisenhower has a heart attack. Here is the big, strong general, but of course he'd been a chain smoker and had a lot of stress in his life, and he has a heart attack, and people are really thinking, oh my God, Nixon could be president. And he was quite young. He was in his late 30s at that point, and already a very divisive figure, primarily because of his way of electioneering, but also, and this just runs throughout, he was just someone that rubbed people the wrong way. From the very beginning, going back to high school, there were some people who liked him. And one of those people was John Kennedy. And he features, both of my anecdotes I want to tell involve the Kennedys in interesting ways, but he features in here. So Eisenhower has had a heart attack. Nixon and everyone around him thinks there's a good chance he could become president. And this makes people, including Nixon, very, very nervous. And what then happens is Eisenhower, of course, recovers. And, medicine's come a long way since then. It was not a sure thing that he would recover and be able to resume his term and indeed run for another term. And Nixon really conducts himself admirably during this whole episode. There's no egomania. There's no behind-the-scenes maneuvering. He started doing everything that a vice president ought to do. Yet, when Eisenhower comes back into office and back to work, he pretty quickly kind of brings Nixon in, and it's kind of in the wind, and says, what about if you moved into the cabinet? And so even though this kind of would make sense for various reasons for Nixon to do, he can't help but suspect, and of course Nixon's super insecure, that nobody wants him to be president.
Why don't you get out of the on-deck circle?
Yes, that's right. So he does not enjoy that suggestion and what it implies. And I'm just going to read a little bit here. Nixon's friend and future rival, Senator John Kennedy, was struck by Ike's treatment of the vice president. Eisenhower, quote, won't stand by anybody, Kennedy told Arthur Schlesinger. He is terribly cold and terribly vain. In fact, he is a Nixon was in, quote, absolutely indescribable anguish, Bryce Harlow recalled. The tension showed. Nixon was in and out of hospital beds, complaining of stress, drinking, popping uppers and downers, and fleeing to Florida for therapeutic outings on Rebozo's boat. During one long escape from Washington using Woods as a conduit, Nixon reported to Hutschnecker on his progress. He was having, quote, up and down periods, he complained, even on vacation. Quote, on Wednesday, which was the 8th day here, I did not feel so hot, unquote. Hard work or forced relaxation, his anxiety persisted. I don't see any relation to how you feel to what you do. And I'm skipping a little bit here. He was taking Equinol for his anxiety and Dexamyl, an amphetamine that prescribed for depression and anxiety, and Doradin to sleep. Quote, "In the evening, if I have 2 or 3 drinks, I feel good," he told the doctor.
There's something so
in
50s
addition to
about
all those
that.
pills.
Yeah. And it's kind of unexpected, I think, when people think about Nixon in later years. And one other little teeny interesting piece from earlier in the book. This is when Nixon is running together with Ike on the Republican ticket in 1952. And they're making, sort of a lot about him and his picture-perfect family. Of course, he has his wife, Pat, and his 2 young daughters, Julie and Tricia. And here's just a teeny bit. The inquiring photographer from the Washington Times-Herald caught Tricia on the street outside the Nixon home. Quote, "He's always away," Tricia told her. "If he's so famous, why can't he stay home?" Now, here's the footnote. The photographer's name was Jacqueline Bouvier, and in 1953, she would marry Dick's friend, John Kennedy, who had just been elected to the Senate.
That's amazing.
Fascinating. But it's that kind of biography where every page you just think, oh, my God, there's just so much more here, So... more to come because I'm only halfway through, but that's where I am now. Let's run quickly through the books again. John, you're reading?
I read The Mountain Lion by Jean Stafford.
I read How to Be a Family, the year I dragged my kids around the world to find a new way to be together by Dan Coyce.
I'm reading Kudos by Rachel Cusk.
And I'm reading Richard Nixon, The Life by John Farrell. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thank you.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.